Hello and welcome to a walk-in tour of historic Bridgetown. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. Our tour guides are President of the Barbados National Trust, historian Dr. Carl Watson, and Senator Professor Henry Fraser. If you were to say to anyone that you reside 7 miles from Bridgetown, the measurement would have been taken from this point, for all distances from Bridgetown started at the base of his foot. It is arguably one of the more controversial pieces of iconography in Barbados, the statue in the likeness of a man who proclaimed that the slave trade was a necessary evil which provided a training ground for Britain's sailors and kept her economy strong. His speech against the Foreign Slave Trade Bill introduced into Parliament in 1806 stopped the abolition movement headed by William Wilberforce from passing laws to ban the slave trade in the British Empire.
I'm not going to get into any extensive debate. There is an ongoing debate, and I debated it in the newspapers for over a year. But I will say this, Barbadians are not in agreement with either the role, the function, or the purpose and meaning of this statue. And this statue means different things for different people. But the only thing I would say is that in the early 19th century, who put the funds together here in Barbados to erect the statue, what did it mean for them? Because if each succeeding generation imposes its own interpretation of history, historical personages, and the meaning of the past, then the present continually changes the past, and the past becomes meaningless, or as Longfellow said, the past is a foreign country. Horatio Nelson had meaning for the people of Barbados in 1805, 1806, 1807. That meaning is not the same meaning for us today. Do we respect them for their understanding of the meaning then? Do we, as I said, try to enter their mindset and go back to a point in time when the world was so volatile and warfare was imminent and everybody looked constantly on the horizon to see when French naval vessels were coming to seize the island? And it didn't matter if you were free or enslaved, because capture by the French had the same meaning for the free as it did for the enslaved. You know, the argument has been that this is a representation of colonial times and of colonial oppression, etc. Whatever the merits of that argument are today, it does not contradict the merits of the argument that erected it in the past. So that's my take on the matter.
Well, of which Dr. Watson is entitled to. Despite our views, 2013 will be a very special year for this statue of bronze. It will be 200 years since its erection here as a colossal, keeping watch over what used to be a garden of remembrance for the enslaved Africans and what is now known as National Hero Square. Well, from the story of Nelson to a Fraser family lore, a tale which occurred on Broad Street, perhaps we could term it Gone in the Wind.
This is another personal thing. I mentioned that my great-grandfather's sister, who was mistreated by Mr. Barrow over Caroline Lee. And then I showed you my tombstone in St. Michael's Cathedral. Well, they said Dr. Henry Fraser of St. Michael's Cathedral operated his medical practice from this site. This was the home of Dr. Fraser in the 1820s, and it was called number 14 Broad Street. There's a family story that his wife, his widow, who ended up raising 7 children so that my great-grandfather went to work as a cash boy or something like that at the age of 12, that in the hurricane of 1831, she went out of the door of the house when she shouldn't have, and she was swept away by the wind. And she was found, when the hurricane was over, almost unconscious, wearing only her underclothes because her dress had been stripped off. And so, blowing in the wind. So the family lore said after that, her daughter, who remained a spinster all her life, but was taken into my great-grandfather's household to raise his children, she always insisted that whenever there was bad weather, everyone put on several layers of clothes in case there was a hurricane, you see. So this was the family home, and it was a typical shop front. Everybody lived in the town, and they had their business in the shop downstairs, and they lived upstairs. And Henry Fraser's son, who went to work at the age of 12, became a printer's apprentice and then a printer, and then he bought a newspaper called the West Indian, which was run by the West Indian father of Moravianism in Barbados, the Reverend Edgell. People have heard of Reverend Edgell, who was the first Bayesian Moravian priest. He had run a newspaper, and then he went into the priesthood, and he sold his newspaper called the West Indian to my great-grandfather, and it operated from here. And then I had a great uncle who went off to do medicine, and my grandfather did dentistry, and they both operated their medical and dental practice from right here. And then, as so often happens between families, two brothers fell out. They had a great big quarrel, and when the brother who inherited this little place actually died, he died intestate, and the property went to the government. And then a jeweler operated from here. What was the name of the jewelry shop? Bailey. Louis Bailey operated the shop from here when I was a boy.
The tour continues now and calls attention to a special feature for wives that were to be found on many of the houses in Bridgetown.
This is a lovely example of a balconied building with a cupola at the top or a lookout. The houses in Belize and in Boston and Baltimore and all the seaports of the USA would have these little lookouts, and they would be called widows' walks, because the widow would be up there, or the woman would be up there looking out for the ship that meant her husband was coming back after months at sea, whether he'd survived the war, whether he'd survived the trip.
When similar features were found on business places in Bridgetown, they had a slightly different utility.
In the days of sailing ships, the merchants who got the information first were able to profit from it. So they would send clerks up with telescopes to look out, and when they saw ships on the horizon, they'd immediately say, "Get out the goods, the ships are coming in." So it was a means of maintaining intelligence about the potential commerce and potential economic benefits.
Then you saw scores of these little cupolas looking out to sea. So this is McGregor Street, and you can see that this building from the front here, going right back, these are all very old buildings. This entire block is the other block that seems to be a block that has survived the fires. And at the end of the street, for people in the Chamber of Commerce, at the end of the street is the building which was the building of James A. Lynch. And James A. Lynch was the grandfather of Sir Douglas Lynch, and he was one of the prominent members of the Chamber of Commerce, and his beautiful building was at the very end. That in earlier days was one of the hotels of Barbados, according to Warren Alleyne, because this was the hotel district all around here.
Canary Lane. It's one of the oldest streets of Bridgetown. Canary Lane, yes. It was renamed St. George Street, but the old name in the 17th and 18th century was Canary Lane. I wanted to speak to a free-colored lady who lived down here. She had many properties in Bridgetown, and her name was Rachel Pringle Palgreen. And she owned the Royal Naval Hotel. And this was an establishment on the street where sailors, British sailors, would frequent. And the young Prince William, who later was going to become King William IV, was here as a Royal Naval Cadet. And he and many of his fellow officers came to Rachel Pringle's establishment, where they had a grand time, and they drank too much Barbados rum and trashed her place. And I don't know how many, does everybody know the story of Rachel Pringle Palgreen? Is there anybody here who does not know Rachel Pringle Palgreen's story? Raise your hand if you do not know. Rachel Pringle Palgreen, who was actually born a slave and was freed, and became a businesswoman, this was one of her properties. So as I said, the young prince and his cadets wrecked Rachel's place. They broke up all her furniture. The following morning, she got her men to row out to the ship HMS Boreas, anchored in Carlisle Bay, and she got him to wake up the prince, who, when he came, he apologized and said, well, Rachel, you know, we really didn't know what we were doing. We're very sorry that we mashed up your place. And she said, well, yes, Your Highness. But anyway, not to worry, I have here a list of the itemized damage. And she had a long list. And she was a very smart businesswoman. And she itemized all her damages and multiplied them by about a factor of 3. And she presented it to the prince, who had a roaring hangover. And so he just sort of said, you see, pay Rachel. And he went back to sleep. And so from that incident, she emerged a richer woman, was able to buy another property, and so her business empire kept expanding. And she's buried today in what is St. Mary's churchyard. So that's one of the many stories of the free-colored women of Bridgetown. There was a story about Nancy Clark, and there was a rhyme. Nancy Clark can get in the dark, and when she get in the dark, she can throw aquafortis on you. Aquafortis was something like nitric acid. And this lady was reputed to have many admirers, but she was also a jealous woman. So if you troubled any of her men friends at all, you were in for a hard time.
From the tales of Nancy Clark to the story of the cabs or cabbies operated from the site.
100 years ago, 150 years ago, there was a huge evergreen tree where that small one is now. And that's where the taxi rank of Bridgetown used to be. There was a big evergreen tree here and a big evergreen tree up by National Heroes Square. And that's where people would bring their horse-drawn carriages. So if you were tired and you had the money, you could take a cabbie. And they were called cabs. That's why today we still use the cab, but we apply it to a motor vehicle. But in the old days, a cab was a type of gig or a horse-drawn carriage that you could rent to take you from point A to point B. Then, of course, there was the tram. 100 years ago, the tram line ran through Broad Street, ran up Bay Street, or ran up to the top of Pine Hill.
The Mutual Building is certainly one of our city's treasures, standing majestically towards the western end of Broad Street. It is a perennial landmark of Bridgetown, which came to personify the colonial powers of Barbados.
This particular structure is a mix of styles, but it's typical of many buildings of the late Victorian period. It incorporates, for example, a magnificent cast iron balcony, which is one of the few surviving cast iron balconies on the island.
The Barbados Mutual is over 150 years old, but the building is not as old. That's late 19th century. I think it's about 1880, and it was built in the style of the period, of a grand building. Insurance companies were now all very powerful, and so they demonstrated their wealth and their power by building what they considered would be the grandest building of Barbados, surpassed now only by the Central Bank, of course. And so there you have a building with a wonderful Palladian-style pediment at the top, at the center. It's on 3 stories with the kind of orders in terms of the height and the grandeur of the detailing of the windows and so on. It's at the height of the Victorian period, so of course it is surrounded by a Victorian-style beautiful balcony with cast iron balustrades and columns. And at the top you have the 2 silver domes. Now those silver domes carry a story as well, because when the famous travel writer Patrick Leigh Fermor came to Barbados in the 1950s, he tried to have a meeting with Sir Grantley Adams, and he eventually succeeded. And he suggested to Sir Grantley that they go and have a drink at the yacht club, because he'd been taken to the yacht club. And Sir Grantley said, no, I am not allowed into the yacht club, and he was the premier. And so they went to Enid's on Baxter's Road. And when this had considerable significance in Patrick Leigh Fermor's mind, of course, the concept of the racism in Barbados in 1950. And so as he sailed away, he concluded his chapter about Barbados by saying, as we sailed out of Carlisle Bay, I looked back at the Grand Barbados Mutual building with the silver twin orbs of empire, the cricket ball and the black ball. There's another story about the Mutual building that I have to tell you. Governor Pope Hennessy, who tried to bring together Barbados and the Leeward and Windward Islands in a confederation. And you remember that the whole confederation issue was misconstrued and it led to riots. Pope Hennessy was then asked to withdraw and went back home to Britain. And as a result of the whole thing, Sir Graham Briggs, his close friend, who had supported confederation and the whole idea of a kind of democratic union between the Eastern Caribbean countries. Graham, who was just about the most prominent, well-known man in Barbados, who hosted all royal visitors to lunch at his house and so on, Sir Graham became exceedingly unpopular. And as a result of his support for Pope Hennessy and the Confederation, he was read out of the Bridgetown Club. The Bridgetown Club was on the top floor, and the conservatives who ran the Bridgetown Club said, "We don't want you in our club anymore." And the sign that went up on the door saying, "Sir Graham Briggs is no longer a member of this club," was signed by his brother-in-law. And Sir Graham went to Nevis and he saved the sugar industry in Nevis, because you will remember that in the 1870s, the whole reason for confederation was because of the collapse of sugar. Plantations were going bankrupt, planters were going bankrupt, and Nevis had virtually, lost its sugar industry. So Graham decided, I don't know why, that he would go to Nevis. He went to Nevis, he took managers with him, he took a whole cohort of people, and he resurrected the sugar industry of Nevis. And according to the historians of Nevis, they sang songs about him, the equivalent of our crop over calypsos about Sir Graham Briggs, who became the great hero of Nevis.
And so from Sir Graham Briggs and his success story with the sugar industry in Nevis, Dr. Watson provides reasons as to why Bridgetown was selected as the capital city, and the story of the 1854 cholera outbreak right here in Barbados.
Why on all of Barbados was Bridgetown, or the area where Bridgetown grew up, chosen as the site for the capital city? What's the importance of it? And in real estate, there's the term location, location, location. Location has the greatest what's called market value. Location sells. So, Bridgetown occupied its ideal location because any port town must connect or act as the conduit for the producing hinterland and the bay or sea area where the goods produced in the hinterland are exported. This is a function of a port town, which is what Bridgetown is. It is an economic and commercial enterprise that later had social significance. And even prior to the 17th century, even prior to the settlement by the English here in 1627, there were peoples who lived in the Bridgetown area. These were the Amerindians who lived here for many thousand years. And every time you excavate in Bridgetown, you find evidence, if you go beyond the occupational levels of Europeans and Africans, under their refuse, because what is archaeology but the retrieval of yesterday's garbage to interpret the lifestyle that people lived then. So if you go below the 17th century garbage, you eventually find the garbage of the Amerindians who lived here 2,000 and 3,000 years ago. So peoples for many thousands of years have lived in this area. And for humans to live in fixed residential spots, the most important thing they need, there's one very important thing that humans need. Let me see, I'm not going to ask Grace, who's one of my ex-students. No. Let me check first of all. You, sir. What most important thing do humans need if they're going to live in any spot? Food. All right? You say food. Now, young man, what most important thing? If you were living somewhere, you heard that gentleman say food. But what do you need that's even more important than food? You can go without food for 2 weeks and live, but the other thing, you can't go for longer than 3 days without and live. So what is that thing? And here's a hint. Look at what you're carrying in your hand. Yes, well, otherwise, and your mommy will tell you, water, right, water. Yes, you need something to drink. No, you're right. Yeah, we dehydrate very quickly. And so, we are right on the banks of the Constitution River, which is both a tidal inlet and the recipient for fresh water coming down from the water catchment area. You don't see it as much these days because with the huge quarry built by the Rayside group, that acts as a suck now for all the water coming down from the countryside. So you don't have the enormous amount of water coming down that you had in the past. But all around Bridgetown there are springs. There was a beautiful spring just up the road where the Queen Elizabeth Hospital is now. Wherever you dig in town, you go down and you come across layers of the roots of a particular tree that grows in water, the mangrove tree. Bridgetown was full of swamps. Just in the back of the public buildings, there's an area called Palmetto Square. Why was it called Palmetto Square? Again, place names give you clues as to what happened in a particular location. Palmetto Square was a large swamp, and a type of palm tree called the palmetto grew in that swamp, all in the back of what is today Swan Street. In the 18th century, it was also a huge swamp. We think of the Pier Head as being this concrete construction, and it's been here forever in our memories. But 300 years ago, did the Pier Head exist in this form? And no, it did not. In fact, where we're going to by the Screw Dock was actually an offshore reef, and at one point in time a little island. All of this was filled in with garbage to build the Pier Head. There were ponds in this area. In fact, where we're standing now was not even where the core of early Bridgetown grew up. The core of Bridgetown grew up where Mr. Stuart Lane, who is the head of the BTI, Barbados Tourism Investment, in that area, which is his office is just looking across to St. Mary's Church, that area of Bridgetown is actually the core of old Bridgetown. When Bridgetown was already a functioning, vibrant city, this side, the southern side of the Constitution River, still had not been settled. But by the late 18th century, Bridgetown grew and spread and went up Bay Street. So Bridgetown is a growing town. But as I said, it is commercially important, and its importance was one of the factors that was very successful in getting us an inscription on the World Heritage Site. Because the next question one might ask is, well, Bridgetown was inscribed. How was that achieved? What does inscription mean? And then the corollary, of course, is, and what are the benefits to be derived from inscription? Well, inscription implies that the area being put forward for examination by UNESCO, it implies some sort of not just national or regional significance, but it implies international or global significance. So the critic or the cynic might then ask, well, was Bridgetown really globally significant? Was it? And the answer to that is yes, of course it was. Because, let's not forget, in the 17th century, because of the economic success, remember what I said, cities are based on economics, the economic success of Barbados as a producing center primarily for sugar, Barbados and Bridgetown became one of the key producing, exporting centers within the orbit of what became the British Empire, the commercial scheme, and then by extension, trading schemes and ventures and systems elsewhere in the world all linked together. From this island in the 17th century, we traded with Africa, we traded with Asia, we traded as far as China, we traded with South America. So Bridgetown had global significance, and in the British Empire, three main key logistical points in the trading system that we call the North Atlantic system. London, the capital city of Britain, was one. In North America, Boston was the other one. But the third one was Bridgetown, Barbados. So Bridgetown played that pivotal role in world economic system. Now, a number of events transpired within this area. If we could go in a time machine and go back into the past, when sugar was introduced into Barbados, there were a number of components related to the production of sugar. Land, which we had here, capital that was brought in the island, and labor. You needed sugar. There were no machines, nothing. So you needed labor to cut sugar and produce it. Initially, the capitalists, merchants thought that they could have used European indentured labor, which was very unsuccessful. So very quickly, they shifted from using European indentured labor to using enslaved labor brought over from West Africa via the Middle Passage. Another aspect of human tragedy that started just on the banks of the inner basin of the Corinage. I don't know how many of you all know the disease called cholera, or what cholera is like, or what happens to you. Cholera is a waterborne disease. Now, in the 17th and 18th century, there were no taps in Bridgetown. You didn't go to a tap and turn on and water poured from the tap. You went to a pond, and mostly it was a dirty pond because people bathed in it. Sheep and cows went and bathed in it and did whatever they had to do in it. And when you went onto the pond to get water to drink on the morning, first of all, you had to scrape away the green scum on the surface of the pond and whatever else was floating on the surface of the water, all the unmentionable things, and catch your bucket of water. This was drinking water. And very often it wasn't boiled because people didn't understand the importance of boiling. People didn't know that there were things called bacteria that would give you dreadful diseases. They thought it was humors in the air. That's why people would lock up their houses at night to not let the bad night air come in and make them sick. And this was widespread, the idea of humors. Well, so back to cholera. On the banks there, the much enlarged inner basin, in 1854, a ship came into Carlisle Bay from St. Croix. There was a sailor on it who died. Nobody wanted to throw away his clothes. Clothes were very valuable. People didn't live in a throwaway society then. They kept everything and recycled everything. So the dead man was put into the water, but his clothes were kept on board the ship. So when the ship docked here, there were washerwomen who used to make their living washing the clothes of sailors. And this dead man's clothes were sent to one of the washerwomen to wash. Little did she know that that action would cause not only her death, the death of all her family, all her friends, but that action would result in the death of over 23,000 Barbadians in just over 3 months. It spread from the area what we call Street back then too, and it spread over the entire island. 23,000 people died, and it all started here on the banks of the inner basin of the Corinage.
Well, that's it for yet another walking tour of historic Bridgetown. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. Thank you so much for staying with us. I certainly hope you've enjoyed it just as much as I have enjoyed bringing it to you. Special thanks to our tour guide, historian Dr. Carl Watson, and Senator Professor Henry Fraser. Until next time, goodbye.